The Compliance Perspectives podcast is sponsored by Athenian, a leading provider of entity management and governance software. Get started at www.athenian.com. Welcome to the Compliance Perspectives podcast. I'm Adam Turtletaub from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and Healthcare Compliance Association. Joining us today from Munich, Germany is Tobias Kruis. Tobias is head of corporate compliance at Giesecke and Devrient. And today we're going to be talking about his CEI session, Dancing with the Acronyms, jiving through LkSG and CSDDD in the European Compliance Ballroom. Tobias, thank you for joining us. Thank you for speaking in Nashville at the 2025 Compliance and Ethics Institute. Let me start by asking, while in the U.S. there are questions about white-collar enforcement or what's coming next, in Europe things have grown very active with a number of legislative initiatives. I'm looking forward to your session discussing them today. Let's start with the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. What does it call for?
Yes, sure. Happy to do so. And of course, thanks for having me as well, Adam. Well, when it comes to the German Supply Chain Act, or in German, as we call it, the Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz, which is a relatively long term, and therefore it commonly goes by the acronym that you've already used, the LkSG. That is a law that came into effect here in Germany in 2023. It applies to companies with more than 1,000 employees in Germany. And the core focus is on human rights, environmental protection, and occupational health and safety. And it basically includes a couple of requirements for companies that are in scope. The main requirements there would be first, that companies are obliged to do regular and systematic risk assessments, and also some ad hoc risk assessments where that is needed. Then, in addition to that, if risks are identified, companies need to take preventive and remedial measures to address those risks or even violations. And furthermore, companies also need to have in place a complaints or grievance procedure, not only for their internal employees, but also for external stakeholders, particularly for workers in the value chain that can reach out and notify the company about certain concerns in the value chain. In addition to that, companies also need to do annual effectiveness checks on their due diligence efforts. And then the law also includes annual public reporting requirements on those due diligence activities and the outcomes of those activities, and also documentation requirements, including, for example, companies having to publish a statement on their website about their human rights strategy, and also have to update that statement on an annual basis. And then when it comes to the risks or sanctions for non-compliance, the law also introduced heavy fines of up to 2% of the global turnover, and companies can also be excluded from public tenders. That said, I think it's also important to note that the law did not include any civil liability for companies that fail to meet those requirements. And then, so having said that about the requirements, it should also be clarified here that those requirements, those due diligence requirements, apply to the own business area of the company, meaning the own operations, and also, of course, the operations worldwide by subsidiaries or branches. And it also covers the direct suppliers of the company on a worldwide basis. Indirect suppliers, however, are generally out of scope. So you can basically stop with your efforts generally on the tier 1 level, unless the company has any knowledge of potential concerns further up on the in the supply chain. And then last point on the German LkSG would be about the enforcement practice so far. Here we have another acronym coming in, the BAFA, which is the German regulator in this area, which stands for the Federal Office for Economic Affairs and Export Control. And this agency has been relatively active since the law came into force in 2023. And according to information that is available so far, it conducted over 1,000 proactive reviews on the due diligence efforts by companies that fall under those legal requirements. That being said, at least to the best of my knowledge, there have been no fines imposed so far by the agency on any companies for failing to comply with the requirements.
That's interesting. There's so much activity, no fines yet, but of course, we'll see what happens. And also, I think it's interesting that it raises due diligence from something that happens just once at the start of a relationship with a third party, makes it an ongoing issue for organizations and their compliance team. Now, another law of note is the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. What are the requirements there?
Yeah, sure. Happy to explain that. And there we have another long name for another directive. So again, it generally goes by another acronym. So we generally refer to the CSDDD, which is much shorter and easier to pronounce. This is a European legislative act that was adopted last year in 2024. And it mainly builds upon the national initiatives like the German LkSG that we just discussed. And the aim is here to ensure a level playing field for companies in Europe. So like the German law, it requires companies to identify and address adverse human rights and environmental impacts in their operations and in their value chain. But there are several notable differences between the German law and the CSDDD. And just to mention here the key differences, the first one would be that the reach of the CSDDD is broader than the national law. It applies to large European companies, but then in addition to that, also to non-European companies that don't have a subsidiary or a branch or employees in Europe, but that have still significant sales in Europe. And in addition to that, also the due diligence efforts, they don't stop at the tier 1 level, but they cover the whole upstream supply chain, so also indirect suppliers. In addition to that, the CSDDD also introduces civil liability for any harm due to failure to comply with the due diligence requirements. And then another point just to mention here is that the CSDDD also includes a requirement for companies to adopt climate transition plans. However, that is a separate topic, I would say, which is not related to the supply chain due diligence activities. Therefore, I would not go into that in any more detail here in the session. One other point here that I think is important maybe to explain just briefly for the audience, since the CSDDD is a European directive, that basically means that it does not become effective just by itself. It only becomes effective once it has been implemented by the European Union member states, which need to enact national laws to transpose the directive. The timeline to do so was July 2026, so next year, with then a gradual phase-in period for companies to comply with those requirements starting then from July 2027. However, here I think it's also important to say that there have been recent developments since end of last year, beginning of this year. There has been a lot of stakeholder criticism here with regard to the European CSDDD, but also the German LkSG. And in order to respond to that criticism, both laws are currently under review with the aim to cut red tape and also to increase then competitiveness for European companies. So the German government, the new coalition government that started to work earlier this year in Germany, they already announced plans to align the LkSG, the national German law, with the requirements under the CSDDD. And also for the CSDDD, there has been already a decision on the European level to postpone the deadline that I just explained to implement the directive. So that has been pushed back by another year. And currently there are several proposals in discussion in the legislative revision process to, let's say, relax or simplify the due diligence standards under the CSDDD. Again, just to name the most important ones, and as I just said, they're all still under review and under discussion, so it's still a bit unclear what will be the outcome. We have to wait until later this year, where then hopefully we should know a bit more about that. But the main points would be that there are proposals to increase the company size threshold, maybe up to even companies with more than 5,000 employees and 1.5 billion of revenues, which would significantly reduce the number of companies that fall within the scope of the requirements. In addition to that, the deadline for compliance with those laws might be pushed even further back, maybe even to mid 2029. There's also discussion around simplifying the due diligence efforts, particularly limiting it like the LkSG just to the tier one suppliers, also ensuring that a risk-based approach is used, and also maybe introducing longer assessment cycles for the due diligence for the risk analysis. In addition to that, data demands might be limited. There might be more flexibility for companies to address concerns identified suppliers, and the civil liability regime that is included in the CSDDD, that might be removed as well. And then last but not least, there's also a discussion or a proposal to include a prohibition in the CSDDD, which would prohibit member states, European Union countries to implement stricter standards than the CSDDD. So what is called gold plating. There would be no option for countries like France or maybe Germany to maintain stricter standards than the CSDDD going forward.
It'll be interesting to see how that all evolves. So finally, what are some practical tips that have already emerged for complying with the laws from your experience with the German LkSG?
Yeah, sure. Happy to share that. I think my first lessons learned here would be that really human rights due diligence is something that cannot be done just by a single department, may that be the compliance department or whichever department is responsible in the company for these efforts. And to stay within the picture of my session's title, I would say it takes two to tango, or maybe even more, actually like a square dance, where you need to interact with multiple dancers and ensure that your choreography is also well synchronized. So that means that you really need to collaborate across departments. That means HR, quality management, for example. Your procurement department is very important because you need procurement basically to implement the due diligence efforts in the onboarding process, in the risk assessment. If you have a sustainability or ESG team, you need to align and coordinate with them also on their efforts on the reporting requirements. So collaboration across departments is really key for meeting those requirements and staying in close contact. The other recommendation would really be avoid a one-size-fits-all approach, or what in German we would call a watering can approach. You really need to apply a risk-based approach to avoid that you overburden your own organization, but also overburden your suppliers with demands that are not tailored and that are not strictly necessary. And I think that's the biggest learning from the German law, where when it kicked in, a lot of companies were nervous. There was a lot of uncertainty about the requirements. So I think a lot of companies had a tendency to over-comply and send floods of questionnaires that were not tailored to relevant risks to companies. And that created probably a lot of backlash, and is maybe one of the causes also for the revision that we are seeing at the moment. So be focused, apply a risk-based approach, and of course ensure that your efforts and also your reporting is consistent and aligned across different reporting requirements by the different departments like sustainability, as I just said, or also HR. And of course, watch the space, watch the regulatory developments, and reevaluate and adjust your program to the requirements as they evolve.
I think that's all great advice. I have to say, recently I saw a supplier questionnaire that showed the dangers of a too broad a standard one, where most of the questions were totally irrelevant for anything but, say, the largest companies. And you certainly don't want to be burdening your vendors with all of that and not getting the real information that you need. Well, Tobias, thank you for sharing these insights with us today. I look forward to your presentation at the 2025 Compliance and Ethics Institute. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen. I'm Adam Turtletaub from SCCE and HCCA. I hope we're able to expand your compliance perspective.